I think the issue with the South Pacific is there's quite a diversity of countries in there, but there are some common risks across all of them. Obviously, sea level rise is a significant concern for most countries, although that depends. Some countries are entirely low-lying, and so sea level rise is a significant concern for them. Others have more land and more mountainous areas, and so there's an ability to at least cope with sea level rise to some degree. I think there are, so that's a well understood risk, and that's not going away. I think there are other risks that we're seeing emerge in the South Pacific. Certainly drought, particularly more in the Western Pacific, is becoming a bigger and bigger problem. This year we're going into an El Niño. There's already reports of food shortages in Papua New Guinea. There are millions of people at risk there, and that's a significant humanitarian problem that I think we're going to see more issues like that into the future, in the absence of any other forms of development to manage those risks. There are significant concerns around fisheries, and so in some countries, particularly the smaller countries, fishing is a major source of protein and a major source of healthy protein for many communities. About half of fish consumption comes from reef-based fisheries, about half comes from ocean-based fisheries. We're seeing that increasing pressure on coral reefs because of sea surface temperature warming, coral bleaching and ocean acidification may impact upon the supply of reef-based fishing, and that actually is very often forms of food that are procured by women, and so the declining productivity from reef-based fisheries can translate through into problems about power dynamics in households between men and women. The pelagic fisheries, principally tuna, we are beginning to understand that the migration patterns of those fish may change as the oceans warm. They may move out of range of some local fishermen, and indeed also may change the ability of Pacific Island countries to capture a rent on fishing within their exclusive economic zones. And so that's going to have multiple effects, both in terms of household food consumption, but also in terms of economic development for many of these countries as well. Then finally, we're anticipating increasing damage from extreme events, from storm surges and cyclones in particular, flooding in some cases. And this may put significant stress on urban infrastructure and water resource infrastructure in particular. One of the other things to consider here, and this is particularly true more in the Western Pacific, is socio-economic development trends. It's quite clear that there's going to be significant population growth, particularly in Melanesia. And particularly that growth is going to be concentrated in cities, and those cities are going to be coastal cities. And so at the same time as we're seeing changing coastal dynamics and increasing risk on the coast, we're going to see more and more people living in urban areas in the coastal zone, particularly in Melanesia, and that would seem to be a convergence of trends that is going to amplify risk into the future. So for these and many other reasons, the small island states consider climate change as perhaps their principal security problem. Particularly the very small island states, Tuvalu, Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, and they express that concern frequently through the United Nations system, through the Security Council, the General Assembly, through the Framework Convention on Climate Change. I think this is going to be I think we already see this as probably the principal source of tension between the small island states and its regional larger countries like Australia and New Zealand. I think this is the premier issue in international relations. I think the response of Australia, New Zealand and the United States to this issue of climate change in small island states will increasingly define their profile in the international system. I think we're going to see 30 to 40 small island states and 15 to 20 Pacific Island countries consistently and repeatedly stress the failure of their more developed countries to assist with this problem, and I think that's going to be very damaging to the international reputation and standing of countries like Australia. I think we're seeing very good progress in community-based adaptation insofar as it's been trialled. It seems to work quite well, and it fits very well with the logic of, particularly outside cities, the communal-based living, collective forms of organisation around customary property resources. And so community-based adaptation harnesses that logic and decision-making and that ownership of resources very well, and it's very cheap and it's very effective, and it nudges decision-making at the local level into more sustainable forms through water resource management or coastal management and so on. The issue there is the extent to which that can be scaled up to be replicated across all rural communities in the Pacific, and it doesn't necessarily address the urban problems I talked about earlier, but I think that's very positive, and it's cost effective, and the constraint really there is a human resource constraint, having enough people to do this work with local communities. That's a training issue more than a funding issue, I think. At least one challenge here, however, is I think that the politics of saying climate change is the responsibility of the international community and they need to help the small island states is probably now getting in the way a little bit. That's not to say that that's not completely true, but it is to say it's not a basis perhaps for shared action to solve these problems in the Pacific Island countries, and that local Pacific Island governments, I think, need to be more strategic and systematic in controlling this agenda, in developing the adaptation process, in getting the international community behind their local adaptation plans in a way that means that small island states are in charge of this, and it's a shared responsibility and a cooperative approach. So I think shifting that narrative to being a solutions-focused strategic response to adaptation driven by small island states is going to be an important reason to move forward. And so